I'm Samantha Hart, 34, sitting at the defense table in my own courtroom, thumb tracing the red wool scarf in my lap. Across the aisle, Kevin and Karen were laughing with their attorney, already spending the $5.5 million they thought they were about to steal. They didn't even recognize me. Then the bailiff's voice cut through the room. All rise for the Honorable Judge Samantha Hart. My parents stood expecting a stranger. But I stood with them. I walked past the bar, up the steps, and took my seat behind the bench. Their lawyer's smirk froze instantly. I need you to be the jury today. If your parents threw you away like luggage to make a profit, would you let them back in for a second chance, or would you destroy them? Drop a guilty or innocent in the comments right now. I want to see where you stand before I tell you what they did. It was 1994 and O'Hare International Airport was the loudest place on earth. Terminal 3 hummed with a frequency that vibrated right through the soles of my sneakers. People were rushing, announcements were chiming, and the conveyor belts buzzed with an endless, mechanical drone. But I didn't feel part of the motion. I felt like a stone in a river, stuck in heavy while everything else flowed around me. I was 5 years old, wrapped in a red wool scarf that scratched my neck. It was itchy and too long, dragging on the dirty linoleum, but I refused to take it off. It was the only thing standing between me and the biting draft of the automatic doors. Kevin and Karen were walking ahead of me. They weren't holding my hand. They were checking their watches, their movements sharp and synchronized. They didn't look like parents who were about to lose a child. They looked like people running late for a business meeting. They looked annoyed. Karen glanced back, her eyes narrow. Keep up, Samantha. You're slowing us down. They led me past the ticket counters, past the happy reunions at the gate, all the way down to the oversized baggage claim. It was a cavernous, industrial space where golf clubs and car seats were spat out onto a metal carousel. The air smelled like jet fuel and stale coffee. Wait here, Kevin said. He pointed to a metal bench bolted to the floor. Watch the bags. We have to go get the tickets. Don't move until we come back. How long? Asked my voice small. Just count the bags, Karen said, not looking at me. She was looking at the exit signs. Count 500 bags. By the time you finish, we'll be here. I sat down. I pulled the red scarf up over my nose. And I started counting. 1, 2, 3. A set of skis. A guitar case. A cardboard box taped shut. I counted to 50. I counted to 100. The crowd thinned out. The buzz of the belt became rhythmic, hypnotic. 200. 300. By the time I reached 500, the carousel had stopped moving. The other passengers had collected their things and left. The lights seemed to dim, humming with that low-voltage sound that only lonely places make. I sat there, gripping the wool of my scarf, and I realized something that a 5-year-old shouldn't have the vocabulary to understand. They weren't late. They weren't lost. The look on their faces when they walked away hadn't been panic. It had been relief. They had dropped me off at oversized baggage because that is exactly what I was to them. Heavy. Burdensome. Something to be checked and never claimed. That was when the silence hit me. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down on my chest until I couldn't draw a breath. That silence broke something inside me. It stole my voice. 4 years after that night, I barely spoke. I let the world happen to me because I was too afraid to make a sound. It took me 3 decades to learn that silence could be a weapon, not just a wound. Today, when I sit on the bench and the courtroom goes quiet waiting for my ruling, I control the silence. I use it to command respect. But back then in Terminal 3, the silence commanded me. Told me I was nothing. I don't know how long I sat there frozen. Eventually, a security guard on a Segway rolled past, did a double take and circled back. But before he could say anything, a man in a gray suit stepped out from the shadows of a pillar. He had been standing there for a while, I realized later. Watching. Waiting to see if anyone would come back. He was tall, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like an accountant. She's with me, the guard said, reaching for his radio. I'm calling social services. No, the man said. His voice was soft but cut through the air like steel. He walked over and knelt in front of me, ignoring the grime on the floor. He didn't touch me. He just looked at me right in the eyes, acknowledging my existence. My name is William, he said. I saw them leave. I'm sorry. He didn't lie. He didn't say they were coming back. He told me the truth, and in that moment he saved me from the lie I was trying to tell myself. He stayed with me until the police arrived. He stayed through the foster care placement. And eventually he stayed for good. He was the safety net that caught me when my own blood let me drop. William died on a Tuesday morning, quietly the way he had lived. There was no fanfare, no headlines, just a small service attended by the shelter staff he had secretly funded for decades. I sat in the front row wearing the red scarf, feeling the weight of the silence return. He had been my anchor, the one person who proved I wasn't just luggage to be left behind. Then came the reading of the will. I expected the house, maybe a modest savings account. Instead, the lawyer handed me a portfolio thick with documents. William wasn't just a retired accountant. He was an angel investor who had backed 3 of the biggest tech startups in the 90s. He had lived simply so he could give generously. The final number was $5,500,000. $100,000 for every year of his 55-year career. He left it all to me. The news broke 2 days later. Local judge inherits secret fortune. It was the beacon I had dreaded. It took exactly 48 hours for the phone to ring. It wasn't a call. It was a process server. I was served with a lawsuit at my home address, fraudulent custody and estate theft. The plaintiffs were Kevin and Karen Hart. They didn't call to ask how I was. They didn't ask to meet. They sued. They claimed William had kidnapped me from the airport 30 years ago. They claimed they had been searching tirelessly for 3 decades, victims of a sophisticated abduction plot. They demanded the full $5.5 million as restitution for their pain and suffering, plus the deed to William's house. I sat in my living room reading the complaint. It was a masterpiece of fiction. They described their agony at losing their beloved daughter. They described the hole in their hearts that never healed. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I went into chambers mode. I looked at the lawsuit not as a daughter but as a judge reviewing a case file. And that's when I saw it. The narcissistic ledger. To normal parents, a child is a person. To Kevin and Karen, I was an asset. When I was 5, I was a liability, a mouth to feed, a burden to carry through an airport. So they liquidated me. They left me at baggage claim to cut their losses. But now, 30 years later, my value had changed. I wasn't a liability anymore. I was a receivable. I came with a $5.5 million price tag. They weren't back because they missed me. They were back because their investment had finally matured and they wanted to cash out. It wasn't love. It was accounting. They were trying to balance their books with my life. And the audacity of it, the sheer unmitigated greed, burned away the last vestiges of the frightened little girl inside me. They thought they were suing a victim. They didn't realize they were suing the law itself. I put the papers down. I didn't call a lawyer immediately. Instead, I walked to the mirror and looked at myself. I saw the eyes of the child who counted to 500. I saw the woman who had put criminals behind bars for less than this. Motion denied, I whispered to the empty room. I picked up my phone and dialed the best forensic accountant in the state. I need you to dig, I said. Go back to 1994. Find everything. They wanted a fight. I would give them a war. And I would make sure the cost of this lawsuit was everything they had left. I didn't answer the lawsuit. I didn't call Kevin or Karen to scream or beg or ask why. That's what a daughter would do. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was a plaintiff building a case against 2 defendants who had made a fatal calculation error. I went into chambers mode. In my line of work, we don't operate on feelings. We operate on evidence. I called Sarah Jenkins, the most ruthless forensic accountant in Chicago. I gave her one instruction: go back to 1994. Find out where they got their money. Because grifters don't change. If they were greedy enough to sue me now, they were greedy enough to have tried to profit off me then. You don't just walk away from a child and not try to capitalize on the loss. For 3 days, my dining room table turned into a war room. We pulled tax returns, old property records, and court archives that smelled like dust and rot. Most people think the past is buried. It isn't. It's just waiting on microfiche. Sarah found the anomaly on a Tuesday night. Sam, she said, her voice flat. Look at 1995. I leaned over her shoulder. There, buried in a stack of digitized court filings from Cook County, was a civil suit docket number. Kevin and Karen Hart versus American Continental Airlines. They hadn't just walked away. They had sued the airline. I pulled the full case file. My hands didn't shake. They were steady, cold, turning the pages of my own erasure. The complaint was a work of art. They claimed that on November 6, 1994, they had entrusted their beloved daughter to an airline agent at the gate for an unaccompanied minor flight to visit a sick relative. They claimed the airline had been negligent. They claimed I had wandered off and vanished because the staff wasn't watching. It was a lie. There was no ticket. There was no sick relative. They had walked me to baggage claim and left me there. But in 1995, without cameras everywhere, without digital tracking, they could spin a story. They claimed emotional distress and loss of consortium. They claimed they were broken parents whose child had been swallowed by the system. And then I saw the settlement agreement. The airline, desperate to avoid bad press about a missing child, had settled out of court. The check was for $450,000. In 1995, that was a fortune. It was enough to buy a house, 2 cars, and a lifetime of silence. But the check wasn't the smoking gun. The smoking gun was the affidavit attached to the settlement. To get the money, Kevin and Karen had to sign a sworn statement. I read the words, and for the first time in 30 years I felt the air leave the room. We, the parents, acknowledge that the minor child, Samantha Hart, is presumed deceased. We accept this settlement as full and final compensation for the wrongful death and loss of our child, and we absolve the airline of all future liability. They had signed it. Kevin's signature was jagged. Karen's was loopy and neat. They had legally declared me dead. They had looked at a piece of paper that said I didn't exist anymore, and they had signed it in exchange for a check. They didn't lose me. They liquidated me. I sat back in my chair. The anger that had been simmering in my gut didn't boil over. It crystallized. It turned into something hard and sharp like a diamond. They had sold my life for $450,000, spent it all, and now they were back to sell me again. They thought I was a ghost. They thought ghosts couldn't fight back. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. I have it, I said. Don't settle. We're going to trial. I looked at the signatures one last time. They had signed my death warrant. Now I was going to sign theirs. The trial was theater, and Kevin and Karen were the headliners. They took the stand wearing muted colors, their expressions practiced masks of grief. Karen wept on cue. She talked about the hole in her heart that never healed. She described the agony of the unknown, painting a picture of 2 devoted parents who had been victimized by a wealthy predator who stole their baby in a busy terminal. It was a compelling performance. If I hadn't lived the truth, I might have believed them. They didn't look like monsters. They looked like victims. They looked like parents who had spent 30 years setting a place at the dinner table for a ghost. I watched from the defense table, my face impassive. I didn't object. I didn't interrupt. I let them build their monument to grief, brick by lying brick. Because the higher they built it, the harder it would fall. When the defense's turn came, we didn't call character witnesses. We didn't call experts. We called one name. The defense calls Megan Hart. The air left the room. Kevin's head snapped toward the gallery doors. Karen let out a small, strangled gasp. They hadn't seen this coming. They thought Megan, the daughter they kept, the daughter they raised, was loyal. They thought she was part of the con. Megan walked down the aisle. She was 28, a social worker with tired eyes and a posture that apologized for taking up space. She didn't look at our parents. She looked straight at me. It was like looking into a mirror that had aged differently. We had the same nose, the same jawline. But where I had grown hard, she had grown heavy. She took the stand. She swore the oath. And then she dismantled their lives. Megan, my attorney asked. What was it like growing up in the Hart household? Megan took a breath that shook her entire frame. It was like living in a mausoleum, she said. Her voice was quiet but clear. I wasn't just their daughter. I was the replacement. I grew up in the shadow of the tragic lost sister. But it wasn't about missing Samantha. It was about using her. This was the ghost sibling paradox. I had always assumed Megan was the lucky one. She was the one who got to go home. She was the one who got the parents. But as she spoke, I realized I had it wrong. I had escaped. She had been trapped in the performance for 28 years. They used the story, Megan continued. Every time rent was late, every time Dad lost money gambling, they would bring up the tragedy. The church gave them money. The neighbors brought casseroles for years. My sister wasn't a person to them. She was currency. Her absence paid the bills. Karen stood up, her face red. Megan, stop this. Don't you dare. Sit down, the bailiff barked. Megan didn't flinch. She reached into her tote bag and pulled out a shoebox. It smelled like mildew and old attic insulation. They told everyone they spent every dime searching for her, Megan said. They told me they hired investigators. They told me they scourged the earth. But when I was cleaning out the attic last week looking for old photos, I found this. She opened the box. It wasn't full of missing persons flyers. It wasn't full of correspondence with the police. It's casino receipts, Megan said. From the Empress Riverboat Casino in Joliet. She held up a handful of faded thermal paper. These are dated November 7th, 8th, and 9th, 1994. The week Samantha disappeared. While the police were looking for her at the airport, Kevin and Karen were gambling. They weren't searching. They were celebrating. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the same heavy, suffocating silence I remembered from the baggage claim, but this time it wasn't crushing me. It was crushing them. Megan looked at our parents, tears finally spilling over. "I used to feel guilty that I was the one who got to stay," she whispered. "But now I realize. Samantha was the one who got away. I was the one who was left behind." Kevin sank into his chair, a man whose entire existence had just been exposed as a hollow fraud. They hadn't just abandoned one daughter. They had devoured the other. My attorney didn't give the room time to breathe. Megan's testimony had cracked the foundation, but we needed to bring the whole house down. He walked to the bench and placed a single yellowed document in front of the presiding judge. It was a certified copy of the 1995 settlement agreement from the Cook County Archives. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting through the stunned whispers of the gallery. "The plaintiffs are suing for custody of an estate based on their parental rights. However, according to this sworn affidavit signed on December 12, 1995, Kevin and Karen Hart legally declared their daughter, Samantha Hart, deceased." Kevin's face went the color of ash. Karen grabbed his arm, her fingernails digging into his cheap suit jacket. They knew exactly what that paper was. It was the receipt for my life. The presiding judge read the document. Her eyes narrowed. She looked from the paper to the plaintiffs, and the expression on her face wasn't judicial neutrality anymore. It was pure, unadulterated disgust. "Mr. and Mrs. Hart," the judge said, her voice dangerously low. "You accepted $450,000 from American Continental Airlines for the wrongful death of your child. You signed a statement claiming she was gone. So one of two things is true right now. Either you committed grand larceny and fraud in 1995, or you are committing perjury and fraud upon the court today. Which is it?" The trap snapped shut. If they admitted I was alive back then, they were felons who had stolen $500,000. If they stuck to their story that I was dead, they had no standing to sue me now because ghosts don't have heirs. Their lawyer, realizing he had been led into a minefield, physically stepped away from them. He began packing his briefcase. I stood up. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't wait for my lawyer to speak. I walked around the defense table and stood in the center of the aisle facing them. For 30 years I had been afraid of these people. I had let their memory haunt every quiet room I entered. But looking at them now, shivering, trapped, and small, I realized I wasn't looking at monsters. I was looking at parasites. "You sold me," I said. I didn't yell. I used the voice I used when sentencing a violent offender, cold, flat, and final. "You didn't just leave me at the airport. You cashed me in. You put a price tag on your own daughter and you spent it on blackjack and slot machines." Karen tried to speak. She opened her mouth, tears streaming down her face. The same performance she had used on the church, the neighbors, and Megan. "Samantha, please," she choked out. "We were young. We were scared. We loved you." "You declared me dead," I interrupted. "You signed a paper saying I didn't exist anymore so you could buy a boat. Well, congratulations. You were right. The daughter you had is dead. She died in Terminal 3. I leaned in closer, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. This was the gavel of silence. I wasn't drowning in it anymore. I was wielding it. A ghost cannot inherit, Kevin. But a ghost can haunt you. And I promise you, I will haunt you with every legal instrument at my disposal until you wish you had never walked back into my life." The presiding judge banged her gavel. It sounded like a gunshot. "Case dismissed with prejudice. Bailiff, please escort the plaintiffs into custody. I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for immediate investigation into insurance fraud and perjury." Kevin and Karen started screaming as the officers moved in, but I didn't watch. I turned my back on them just like they had turned their backs on me. "Continue." The fallout was absolute. The statute of limitations on the 1995 settlement fraud was a complex legal knot, but the perjury they committed in open court was fresh. They were indicted 3 weeks later. The local news, which had initially run the story of the judge's secret fortune, now ran a very different headline: "The parents who sold their child." Their reputation was incinerated. The church cut them off. The neighbors who had brought casseroles for 30 years demanded explanations they couldn't give. They lost their house to legal fees. They were left with nothing, no money, no status, and no daughters. I didn't keep the $5.5 million. William hadn't given it to me to buy a yacht. He had given it to me to build a safety net. I used the money to launch the Baggage Claim Foundation. We provide top-tier legal defense for foster children aging out of the system, ensuring that when the state stops caring, someone else steps in. We make sure no child ever has to stand alone in a terminal wondering if they matter. 6 months later, I sat in a coffee shop in downtown Chicago. Across the table, Megan was laughing at something I said. She looked different. The weight was gone from her shoulders. She had quit her job at the agency and come to work for the foundation as our lead social worker. We were building a relationship from scratch, brick by brick, without the rot of our parents' lies between us. I reached for my coffee and the sleeve of my coat pulled up, revealing the red wool scarf I was wearing. I didn't wear it because I was cold. I wore it because it looked good. It wasn't a shield anymore. It was just a scarf. The coffee shop was noisy, full of clattering cups and chatter, but for a moment, I let myself listen to the silence underneath it all. It wasn't the terrifying, lonely silence of the airport. It was the peaceful silence of a closed case. It was the silence of a debt finally paid in full. I looked at Megan, I looked at the work we were doing, and I realized that William was right. I wasn't the girl who was left behind. I was the girl who was caught.